The boardroom smelled like leather and ambition, 14 faces arranged around a table that cost more than most families in Cedar Falls earned in a year. Ryan Whitmore stood at the head, his $4,200 suit catching the fluorescent light, his smile the kind that belonged on a man who'd already counted his winnings before the last card was dealt. He gestured toward the far end of the table where a black man sat in a borrowed shirt, his hands still carrying the faint discoloration of burns that hadn't fully healed. A nobody farmer. A convenient prop in my cousin's desperate scheme to defraud this company. Marcus Cole Thompson didn't flinch. He sat with the stillness of a man who'd learned long ago that silence was its own kind of power. In the breast pocket of that borrowed shirt, our USB drive held 847 pages of evidence, and every page was a nail in a coffin that Ryan Whitmore didn't yet know he was building for himself. But to understand how a black farmer from the edge of nowhere ended up sitting in this room, you'd have to go back 23 days to an afternoon when the Nebraska heat pressed down like a hand and the world still made a kind of rough, honest sense. The tractor was a 1987 John Deere, green paint faded to the color of old money, and Marcus was underneath it when the afternoon broke past 100 degrees. Engine grease on his knuckles, sweat mapping rivers down his back, the smell of hot metal and dry earth filling his lungs. 280 acres stretched in every direction, de corn and soybean alternating in rows his great-grandfather had first plowed when the land was nothing but prairie grass and promise. 4 generations of Thompson hands had worked this soil, and Marcus intended to make sure a 5th would too. Inside the farmhouse, Zoe was conducting science. 7 years old, gap-toothed, her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, she'd set up a testing station on the kitchen table using a pH kit Marcus had ordered from the county extension office. Her science fair project on soil composition had consumed the last 3 weeks of her life, with the kind of intensity that made Marcus believe she'd grow up to be something extraordinary. "Daddy, our dirt scored 6.8. Mrs. Patterson says 6 to 7 is the sweet spot for corn." Her voice carried through the screen door, and Marcus smiled beneath the tractor, the only genuine smile he'd worn in days. Because the kitchen table also held other things Zoe couldn't read yet. Equipment lease notices at $1,200 a month. A power bill stamped in red. A bank statement showing $847, which was not enough for a man with a daughter who deserved the world and a farm that demanded everything he had. On the mantel above the fireplace, Sarah's photograph watched over the room with the quiet patience of the permanently departed. 3 years since the accident on Highway 30. One sentence was all Marcus ever allowed himself when the subject arose, and he'd said it only once to Tom Hendricks over a beer on the porch. After that, he never drove faster than 45 miles per hour, and he never spoke her name without his daughter in the room, because Zoe was the part of Sarah that still breathed. The 3rd letter from the Whitmore group sat unopened beside the bills. $180,000 for land worth $420,000 on any honest market. Marcus had torn up the first 2 offers without reading past the header. This one he picked up, studied the letterhead, and fed it to the kitchen trash can while Zoe recorded pH levels in her notebook with the careful handwriting of a child who believed that data mattered. The shadow fell across the dirt at 4:17 in the afternoon. Marcus heard the tires first, the soft crunch of expensive rubber on a road that hadn't seen anything but pickups and grain trucks in years. He slid out from under the John Deere and squinted into the sun. A black SUV sat at the edge of his property, so polished it looked like a rendering error, like someone had dropped a luxury vehicle onto a watercolor of farmland. The door opened and she didn't belong here. That was his first thought, and he recognized its unfairness even as it formed. Heels sinking into dust, a blazer that probably cost more than his monthly diesel bill, hair pulled back in a way that said, "Corner office, not county road." She looked at the fields, the weathered fence posts, the barn with its peeling red paint, and she took it all in without flinching. Then she looked at him. Marcus Cole Thompson? He wiped his hands on a rag that didn't help much. Who's asking? Clare Whitmore walked toward him like she'd rehearsed the approach, but underneath the composure, something was fracturing. When he could see it in the way her fingers gripped the leather folder she carried, white-knuckled, the tendons standing out like cables on a bridge bearing too much weight. "I need a husband by tomorrow." Marcus laughed. The sound came out before he could stop it, rough and honest, the kind of laugh that belonged to a man who'd heard every ridiculous thing the world had to offer and thought he'd finally found the ceiling. She didn't laugh. She didn't smile. "I'm serious." And when he looked at her eyes, really looked, he saw something he recognized. Exhaustion. The bone-deep kind that sleep couldn't fix. The kind that came from fighting a war no one else could see. He'd worn that same exhaustion for a year after Sarah died, and seeing it on a stranger's face stopped his laughter like a hand around his throat. So she set the folder on the hood of his tractor and stepped back. Inside was a world that operated on different rules than his. Legal documents bearing seals and signatures from firms whose hourly rates exceeded his monthly income. A 30-page will dense with language designed to be understood only by those who could afford to hire translators. Articles from business magazines about the Whitmore Group, agricultural development, and land management, a corporation his great-grandfather would have recognized as either savior or threat, depending on who sat in the big chair. And at the center of it all, a clause circled in red ink. Claire's grandfather had built the company from 300 acres in Iowa, turning dirt and determination into something that protected small farmers instead of consuming them. He died 2 years ago, and since then, her cousin Ryan had been maneuvering for control with the patience of a man who understood that empires were stolen slowly. The clause was simple beneath its legal armor. Clare Whitmore would retain controlling interest only if she was married by her 35th birthday. Tomorrow. If she remained unmarried, control transferred to Ryan, who had already drawn plans to dismantle the sustainable agriculture division and partner with developers buying family farms at pennies on the dollar. 40 farm families in the crosshairs. Everything her grandfather built, stripped for parts. Marcus turned to page 17. His eyes stopped moving. "You read subsection 4.3b? Clare blinked. "My lawyers reviewed the entire document." "Your lawyers missed something." He pointed to a paragraph near the bottom margin. "This acquisition clause conflicts with USDA Regulation 7 CFR 1940.304. Federal Land Transfer Protocol for Agricultural Properties. Your grandfather wrote this will to protect the company, but this subsection actually gives Ryan a back door even if you marry, unless the board ratifies independently." The silence that followed was the kind that reshapes assumptions. Clare stared at him, and Marcus watched her recalculate everything she thought she knew about the man standing in front of her with grease on his hands and $847 to his name. Agricultural Engineering, University of Nebraska, graduated with honors. He set the folder down. "Chose the farm because this is home, not because I couldn't do anything else." Claire's composure, already cracked, to shift it into something closer to respect. And Marcus, who had not trusted a stranger in 3 years, felt the unfamiliar pull of a decision that would change everything. "No money," he told her. "If I do this, it's not because you're paying me." He met her eyes. "And no lying. Not about the important things." "Then what do you want?" He thought about Sarah, about Zoe asleep inside with her pH readings and her gap-toothed belief that the world could be measured and understood, about the risk of stepping into a war he hadn't started for a woman he didn't know. If this becomes real, it's because we choose it, not because of a clause, not because of strategy, because we actually decide it's worth something. Claire studied him for a long moment, the wind stirring dust around her ankles, the afternoon light turning the fields to gold. Agreed. Before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Tom Hendricks, his neighbor of 20 years, the kind of man who'd help you dig post holes at midnight and never mention it again. Marcus stepped away to answer. "Marcus, you know the Peterson place sold last month? And Muller's? And the Olson farm on Route 12? Tom's voice carried the careful weight of a man assembling a picture he didn't want to see. "All sold to the same company. Some outfit called Midwest Agricultural Holdings. I pulled the county records. 12 family farms in 3 years, all within 50 miles. Average sale price, 43% of market value." Marcus looked at Claire. She was watching him, her exhaustion momentarily replaced by something sharper. He looked past her toward the house where Zoe slept, toward the photograph of Sarah on the mantel, was toward the bills that never stopped and the land that never quit demanding everything he had. "I'll do it," he told Claire after hanging up. "But you promise me one thing. My daughter doesn't get touched by any of this." Claire nodded. "You have my word." That night, after Claire drove back to her hotel to prepare the paperwork, Marcus stood in Zoe's doorway. She was asleep, arms wrapped around the stuffed bear Sarah had bought at the county fair 2 weeks before the accident. Her science notebook lay open on the nightstand, the last entry reading, pH 6.8, good for corn, good for us. Marcus closed his eyes. He'd spent 3 years building walls, keeping the world at a distance safe enough that nothing could reach in and take anything else from him. Now he was about to open the door to a stranger's war, or when the only thing standing between his daughter and the fallout was a promise from a woman he'd known for less than 2 hours. But 12 families had already lost their land. 12 families who'd worked soil just like his, who'd built lives just like his, who'd been slowly crushed by a machine that Marcus now had a chance to help dismantle. His dignity was not for sale, but it was, he was learning, something worth putting on the line. He didn't know what waited on the other side of tomorrow. He didn't know that Ryan Whitmore had already dispatched investigators to dig into every corner of his life. He didn't know that the war he was stepping into would burn down things he loved and build something he'd stopped believing was possible. All he knew was that his daughter deserved a world where 40 families didn't lose everything so one man could get richer, and that was enough. The courthouse clerk had gray hair and a laminated card he read from like a man ordering lunch. 7 in the morning, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of old coffee and older carpet. Tom Hendricks stood to the side in his cleanest flannel, hands stuffed in his pockets, loyal enough to show up without asking questions and decent enough to keep the ones he had to himself. There were no flowers, no music, no family filling wooden pews with tears and hope, just paperwork and procedure, the machinery of the state doing what it did without caring why. When the clerk asked about rings, Claire hesitated, and Marcus saw the first fracture in her composure that morning, in the briefest flash of a woman who'd once imagined this moment differently. "We're keeping it simple." The clerk shrugged and moved on. 10 minutes. Signatures on a line. Words spoken into dead air. And then they walked out into the Nebraska morning as husband and wife, strangers bound by law, allies in a fight that was only beginning to show its teeth. Claire had arranged for a security company to install cameras around the property the day before. 4 units covering the barn, the driveway, the east field entrance, and the back of the house. She'd paid for them herself, her voice flat and certain when she explained. "Ryan retaliates. It's what he does. When I refused to sign off on displacing those 40 families 3 weeks ago, my fiancé left me the next morning. He's working for Ryan now. This is a man who punishes refusal." Marcus mounted the cameras himself, drilling into wood his father had nailed, angling the lenses to cover the approaches Tom had identified as vulnerable. It was the first thing he and Claire built together, though neither of them called it that. Zoe met Claire at the kitchen table that afternoon. The girl studied this new presence in her house with the analytical silence of a child who had learned to measure things before trusting them. Her science notebook lay open between them like neutral territory. "Do you know what 6.8 pH means for corn?" Claire knelt, so their eyes were level. "I do. My grandfather taught me about soil acidity when I was your age. He used to take me out to the fields in Iowa and let me test the dirt with litmus strips." Zoe's gap-toothed smile appeared slowly, like sunrise over flat ground. "I use a digital meter. It's more accurate." Your grandfather would have loved that. That first week established the architecture of coexistence. Separate rooms, Marcus in his childhood bedroom, Claire in the room his mother had kept until 3 years ago, sleeping under a patchwork quilt his grandmother had sewn in blues and whites, now faded to the color of old sky. He was up at 5, coffee on the porch, then out to the fields, while dew still clung to the corn. Claire worked late into the night, her voice carrying through thin walls as she navigated a corporate battlefield from a farmhouse kitchen, laptop open beside a fruit bowl that needed restocking. Dinners became the bridge. Not romantic, not yet anything close, but a ritual of proximity. I know they talked about weather and crop rotation and small things that filled silence without demanding intimacy. Marcus learned that Claire drank her coffee black and couldn't cook anything more complicated than toast. Claire learned that Marcus read agricultural law journals the way other men watched football, with focus and something close to hunger. But outside the farmhouse, the pressure was building in ways neither of them could fully see. Zoe came home from school on the 4th day and didn't eat dinner. She sat at the table with her fork motionless, staring at her plate with an expression Marcus recognized because he'd worn it himself, the look of someone deciding whether a wound was worth showing. What happened? Silence. Then, quietly, the way children deliver information they know will cause pain. Kyle Brannigan told everyone your wife is a rich white lady who bought you because we're poor. Marcus set down his own fork. He moved to her side of the table and knelt, taking her small hands in his calloused ones. Listen to me, baby girl. This family is not poor. We are rich in land, rich in history, rich in love. 4 generations of Thompsons have worked this soil, and not one of them ever let someone else define what they were worth. He squeezed her fingers. Nobody gets to tell you different. Not Kyle, not anyone. Zoe nodded, her jaw set in a way that mirrored his own, and Marcus felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the knowledge that the thing he'd feared most had already found its way to his daughter's desk. 34 floors above Omaha, Ryan Whitmore stood at a window that framed the city like a painting he'd commissioned. His phone was pressed to his ear, his reflection smiling back at him with the satisfaction of a man who believed the world was a machine he'd learned to operate. A black farmer? She's that desperate? The laugh that followed was the sound of someone who'd confused cruelty with cleverness. He dialed his HR director next. I need evidence this marriage is fraudulent. No rings, no shared history, no dating record. Get investigators to Cedar Falls. I need documentation in 2 weeks. On his desk, a folder contained the next phase. Midwest Agricultural Holdings, the shell corporation registered in Delaware, had already identified 3 more properties adjacent to the Thompson farm, and the development consortium was offering $200 million for the package, but only if the acreage was contiguous. Marcus's 280 acres sat in the center like a stone in a river, diverting everything around it. Ryan picked up a second phone, the prepaid kind, purchased with cash at a gas station in Lincoln. The number he dialed belonged to a man who solved problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. Back at the farm, the second week turned the arrangement into something neither Marcus nor Clare had language for. She appeared at the south fence line on a Tuesday, wearing jeans she'd bought at the general store in town and work gloves that still had the tags on. Her hair was pulled back with a rubber band instead of the careful clips she'd arrived with. Can I help? Marcus almost refused. Why, this was his work, his sanctuary, the one domain where uncertainty couldn't reach him. But he saw something in her face he hadn't expected to find there. A need to be useful that went deeper than courtesy, the hunger of a woman who'd spent years being strategic and had forgotten what it felt like to be simple. Hold this pose steady. I need to tamp the dirt. She held it. 40 minutes in the sun, sweat darkening her collar, not once checking her phone, not once asking how much longer. When they finished, a small cut in her palm bled into the Nebraska dirt, and she looked at it with an expression Marcus hadn't seen her wear before. This is the first honest thing my hands have done in months. She held them up, dirty and real. Everything else is just documents arguing with other documents. That evening, while Claire showed Zoe how nitrogen cycles through soil and Zoe added new data to her science fair project, her voice bright with discovery, Marcus called Tom. Then he called 6 other families. Then he drove to Eleanor Hayes's house on the county road, the retired attorney who'd been his mother's closest friend, a 68-year-old woman with a mind like a filing cabinet and a grudge against injustice that retirement hadn't softened. Eleanor spread the files across her dining table. 12 family farms sold in 3 years. 6 families told the same story when Marcus and Tom knocked on their doors over the following days. The Petersons, a letter offering $110,000 for land appraised at $260,000. Refusal. 3 months later, an environmental lien appeared on their property, citing groundwater contamination that no independent test could confirm. Legal fees mounted. The bank called their operating loan early. They sold for $115,000 to Midwest Agricultural Holdings. The Mullers, same letter, same lowball figure, same refusal. 6 weeks later, the county road accessing their south fields was reclassified as private, cutting off their harvest route. They fought it for 4 months, burning through savings, and sold for $92,000. 6 families, same pattern, same shell corporation, same notary on every transaction. A woman named Patricia Webb, whose office address matched the Whitmore Group's Omaha headquarters. Eleanor removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This isn't business, Marcus. This is racketeering. Fair Housing Act violations, USDA land acquisition protocol breaches. And if any state agency participated in those road reclassifications or early loan calls, you're looking at federal civil rights violations under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. She paused, her eyes sharp behind the fatigue. I'll need at least 2 weeks to trace the corporate structure properly. But Marcus, if this pattern holds, this is bigger than 12 farms. This is a federal case. Marcus handed her the files and drove home through the dark, the headlights cutting tunnels through the Nebraska night. Claire was on the porch waiting, laptop closed for once, 2 cups of coffee on the railing. She didn't ask where he'd been. She read it on his face. It's not just Ryan, is it? 12 families in 3 years, all forced out, all the same method. Claire closed her eyes. When she opened them, something had shifted behind them, a weight redistributed, a decision made. I still have system access to Whitmore Group's internal servers. I'm still CEO on paper. Ryan hasn't revoked my credentials because doing so would trigger a board notification. She set her coffee down. If there are communications about these acquisitions, deleted files, internal memos, they'd be on the legal department's shared drive. And deleted files on our system aren't overwritten for 90 days. It was the first time they'd operated as equals, each bringing a weapon the other didn't possess. Marcus had the ground-level evidence, the families, the patterns, the federal knowledge. Claire had the keys to the castle Ryan thought he'd already locked. The fire started at 1:47 in the morning, 13 days after the wedding. Marcus woke to the smell before the sound, smoke threading through the window screen with the patience of something that knew it had already won. The barn, his father's barn. 50 years of timber and memory, 3 generations of tools hanging from hooks his grandfather had forged, seed for the next season stacked in careful rows. He was across the yard before his mind finished processing, bare feet on gravel, hands grabbing the garden hose that he already knew was a whisper against a scream. Claire materialized beside him, pulling his arm, her voice cutting through the roar. Tom arrived with the volunteer fire department 11 minutes later, their faces grim with the recognition of a battle already lost. Marcus knelt in the mud as the structure collapsed into itself, sparks spiraling upward like something sacred being released. 3 of the security cameras Claire had installed caught the approach. A figure with a gas can at 1:47 a.m., face covered, but the build unmistakable to anyone who'd studied Ryan Whitmore's personnel files. Claire knelt beside him. Soot streaked her face, tears cutting channels through the gray. This is my fault. He did this because I dragged you into my war. Marcus looked at her. He looked at the ruin of everything his father had built with hands that looked like his. And he discovered something he hadn't anticipated. An emotion that arrived without permission and wouldn't leave. He wasn't angry at this woman. He was angry for her. And for someone who'd fought alone so long, she'd forgotten that standing beside someone wasn't the same as standing behind them. I'm not going anywhere. The words came out steady, forged in the heat that was still pushing against their faces. Whatever comes next, I'm right here. At the front door of the farmhouse, Zoe stood in her pajamas, clutching the stuffed bear that had been Sarah's last gift. She watched the fire with eyes too old for 7. Claire rose from the mud, crossed the yard, and wrapped her arms around the girl without speaking. Zoe didn't call her anything. But her small fingers closed tight around Claire's shirt and didn't let go. And in that gesture lived something no legal document could create or destroy. Eleanor called the next morning, her voice carrying the electric current of a discovery that changes the shape of everything it touches. Marcus, I went deeper. The pattern didn't start with Ryan. His father, Gerald Whitmore, ran the same operation in Iowa 18 years ago. 23 family farms, identical methodology, lowball offers, fabricated environmental liens, pressured sales through loan manipulation. Gerald was investigated in 2009, but the case was closed for insufficient evidence. She paused. The federal judge who closed it, Martin Cross, received $47,000 in consulting fees from the Whitmore Foundation the same year. 35 families, 2 states, 18 years, one family's machinery of theft, grinding forward across generations. Claire retrieved the server files that week, or deleted communications between Ryan and his acquisition team. Voice recordings from an internal line Ryan thought had been scrubbed. Financial transfers routed through cryptocurrency to a wallet address Eleanor's forensic accountant traced back to Ryan's personal holdings. $15,000 paid to the man who'd burned Marcus's barn. The night before the board hearing, they sat on the porch where Marcus had sat alone for 3 years. The ruins of the barn stood against the stars like a wound that hadn't decided whether to become a scar or a story. The USB drive held 847 pages, copied 3 times, stored in 3 separate locations. What if we lose? Claire's voice was barely above the crickets, the first time she'd spoken the possibility aloud. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Ani, I need to tell you something. The words came rough, unpracticed, the vocabulary of a man more fluent in soil composition than emotion. This stopped being an arrangement for me. I don't know when exactly. Maybe watching the barn go down. Maybe before that, the afternoon you held that fence post for 40 minutes without complaining. But somewhere between then and now, I stopped performing. Claire didn't move, didn't breathe. I'm not saying I love you. I haven't earned the right to know that yet. But whatever this is between us, it's not strategy anymore. It's real. And win or lose tomorrow, I needed you to hear that. She reached across the space between them and took his hand. Her grip was certain, the grip of a woman who'd spent her life holding things together and had finally found something that held her back. I know. Well, I think I've known since you told me to read subsection 4.3b. Inside, a small voice called through the screen door. Daddy, where are you going tomorrow? Marcus went in, knelt beside Zoe's bed. Daddy's going to fix some things. Like fixing the fence, but bigger. Are you going to win? I'm going to try my hardest, same as you with your science fair. Zoe considered this with the gravity of a child who understood that trying and winning were not always the same thing. Then, with the precision of someone who'd been paying closer attention than any adult had realized, is Ms. Clare going with you? She is. Good. She's got strong hands for holding things steady. Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead and walked back to the porch, where Claire sat with her face turned toward the dark fields and the stars above them and the ruins of something old that was already becoming the foundation of something new. Tomorrow, everything would change. The boardroom was waiting. The evidence was ready. And Marcus Cole Thompson, who had spent 3 years building walls around a grief he couldn't name, was about to tear down walls that had stood for 18 years across 2 states and 35 families who'd never had anyone fight for them before. The boardroom was a cathedral built for money, glass walls framing the Omaha skyline, steel fixtures polished to mirrors. The air conditioned to a temperature that suggested human comfort was an afterthought to asset preservation. 14 board members occupied chairs that cost more than Marcus's tractor payment, either faces arranged in the careful neutrality of people who'd learned to wait before choosing sides. Ryan Whitmore opened with the confidence of a man who'd rehearsed his victory speech. He walked the room through a narrative he'd constructed like architecture, each point load-bearing, each accusation designed to support the conclusion he'd predetermined. The marriage was a fraud. The timing was proof. The absence of rings, of shared history, of any digital footprint connecting Marcus Cole Thompson to Clare Whitmore before 23 days ago was evidence so damning it barely required argument. This man couldn't afford to buy my cousin a cup of coffee, and we're supposed to believe he's her husband? Questions came from the board like artillery. Dates, locations, circumstances. Marcus answered each one with the stripped-down honesty of a man who had nothing to protect except the truth. Yes, they'd met 23 days ago. Yes, the marriage served a legal purpose. No, he hadn't been paid. The board members exchanged glances. Ryan's smile widened. Then Claire stood, and the room shifted in a way that had nothing to do with the ventilation system. She walked to the front with the posture of a woman who'd spent her career in rooms like this, but had never before entered one with something real at stake. Every previous boardroom battle had been about numbers and strategy. This one was about whether the thing her grandfather built would survive the family he'd trusted to protect it. I won't pretend. Her voice carried the steadiness of someone who'd practiced control until it became structural. When I drove to Marcus's farm, I needed a legal solution. That's the truth. And I won't insult this board by decorating it. Ryan leaned back, the smile of a man watching his opponent concede. But what I found there wasn't what I went looking for. Claire's gaze swept the room, landing on each face long enough to make the silence personal. I found a man raising his daughter alone on land his great-grandfather plowed. A man who reads federal agricultural law for the same reason my grandfather walked his fields every morning, because the land matters, and the people on it matter, and someone has to care enough to learn the rules that protect them. She turned toward Marcus, and her voice changed. Not louder, but deeper, drawn from a well she'd kept covered for years. He held a fence post for me in the sun for 40 minutes and never asked why. His 7-year-old daughter taught me more about soil science in an afternoon than my entire R&D division has produced in a fiscal quarter. And when my cousin burned his barn to the ground, when everything his father built turned to ash because of a war I brought to his door, he looked at me and chose to stay. The room was silent. Ryan's smile had frozen into something rigid, a mask that no longer fit the face beneath it. I love him. Not because it's convenient. Not because this board needs to hear it. Because he's the only person I've ever met who cannot be purchased, and in a room full of people who spend their lives calculating value, I'd think you'd recognize how rare that is. Claire nodded to her attorney. The screen behind her illuminated. The first image was security footage, time-stamped 1:47 a.m., a figure approaching Marcus's barn with a 5-gallon container. The second was an audio waveform, and when it played, Ryan's voice filled the boardroom with instructions no amount of legal talent could reinterpret. Burn it. Let him see what stubbornness costs. The third was a financial trail, $15,000 routed through cryptocurrency from a wallet address forensically linked to Ryan's personal brokerage account. But Clare wasn't finished. The screen advanced to a map of Nebraska marked with 12 points, each one a family farm acquired by Midwest Agricultural Holdings, a Delaware shell corporation whose filing address matched the office where Ryan currently sat. Beside it, a second map of Iowa, 23 additional points spanning 18 years, from the same methodology executed by Gerald Whitmore before his son inherited the playbook. Marcus rose. The boardroom regarded him with the particular attention reserved for variables that had just reclassified themselves. He spoke without notes, without rehearsal, with the calm precision of a man who'd spent 20 years studying the laws that govern the ground beneath his feet. 35 families across 2 states over 18 years. Total acquisition cost approximately $8.2 million below fair market value. Each transaction followed an identical pattern: lowball offer, refusal, followed by fabricated environmental liens or manipulated loan terms designed to force sale. The same notary, Patricia Webb, executed 12 Nebraska transactions from an address registered to this company. The 2009 federal investigation into Gerald Whitmore's Iowa acquisitions was closed by Judge Martin Cross, who received $47,000 from the Whitmore Foundation within 90 days of his ruling. He paused, letting the numbers settle into the silence like stones into still water. Under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, state participation in the loan manipulation and road reclassification constitutes federal civil rights violations. Under RICO, the 18-year pattern across 2 states and 2 generations meets every threshold for organized racketeering. This board can act today, or the Department of Justice will act tomorrow. The only question is whether the Whitmore Group controls its own future or lets a federal courtroom decide. Ryan's attorney whispered urgently into his client's ear. Ryan's face had passed through white and arrived at gray, the color of a man watching foundations crack beneath a structure he'd believed was permanent. 3 hours of deliberation followed, board members rotating between closed sessions and the kind of whispered conversations that reshape organizations. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. Ryan Whitmore was removed from all positions within the Whitmore Group, effective immediately. The board validated Clare's marriage and her controlling interest. A formal referral was issued to the FBI for criminal investigation into arson, real estate fraud, and racketeering. Patricia Webb was arrested at her Omaha office before the sun set. Judge Martin Cross received a suspension notice from the 8th Circuit within the week. Ryan's personal assets were frozen pending federal review, and the prepaid phone he'd used to order the fire was recovered from a dumpster behind his apartment building, wiped clean, but not clean enough. The Omaha World Herald ran the story above the fold. CNN's Rural America correspondent filed a 4-minute segment that was shared 200,000 times in 48 hours. The hashtag surfaced and spread with the velocity of something people had been waiting to say, but hadn't found the words for until now. Marcus declined every interview request. All of them. Clare stood before the cameras outside the Whitmore Group headquarters and delivered a single statement. This story isn't about me or my husband. It's about 35 families who deserved justice and a system that failed them. We intend to make sure it doesn't fail anyone else. The Department of Justice opened a multi-state investigation spanning Nebraska and Iowa. USDA initiated a comprehensive review of all agricultural land transactions connected to Whitmore Group entities over the preceding 2 decades. 9 of the 12 Nebraska families received compensation for the difference between their forced sale prices and fair market value. A total of $3.7 million dispersed through a restitution fund Clare established from Ryan's frozen assets. 3 families exercised the option to repurchase their land at the original sale price. The 23 Iowa families saw their cases reopened, the process slower, burdened by 18 years of buried paperwork, but moving. Clare restructured the Whitmore Group from the inside. The sustainable agriculture division her grandfather had built was restored and expanded. A small farm protection fund launched with $5 million in initial capital. Eleanor Hayes, 68 years old and officially unretired, accepted the position of senior legal counsel and told Marcus over coffee that she'd thought her best work was behind her until a farmer's son showed up at her dining table with 12 files and the stubbornness to match. 6 months later, new timber stood on old foundations. Tom Hendricks and 7 neighbors had raised the barn in the old way, hands and hammers and the kind of community effort that no corporation could replicate or purchase. Marcus drove the last nail into the crossbeam and looked down from the ladder at the yard below. Clare was teaching Zoe to mix concrete for the barn floor. Both of them covered in gray dust, both of them laughing at something Marcus couldn't hear but could feel from 30 feet up. Zoe's science fair project had taken second place at the state competition. Her conclusion page, typed in the careful font of a child who believed presentation mattered, read, "Healthy soil grows healthy communities. pH 6.8 is where everything begins." That evening, the 3 of them sat on the porch as the sun dropped behind the fields. Zoe fell asleep against Marcus's shoulder, the stuffed bear tucked under her arm, her breathing slow and certain. Clare reached across and took his hand. The old oak tree that marked the property line stood against the darkening sky, no longer a boundary between his land and Whitmore acreage, but the center of something neither of them had planned and both of them had chosen. Marcus looked at the stars coming out above Nebraska, above the new barn and the old fields, and the daughter breathing against his chest and the woman whose hand fit in his, like the answer to a question he'd stopped asking 3 years ago. For the first time since Sarah, the word home carried weight again. Not the weight of grief or obligation, but the weight of a future being built by hands that had finally stopped holding on and started reaching out. Not because of a clause in a will, not because of corporate strategy or legal necessity, because 2 people who'd spent years surviving alone had discovered that the hardest thing in the world wasn't fighting. It was choosing to build something worth fighting for, and then trusting someone enough to build it together.